because you have so many things to cover, we're going to start at least for the introduction, and we move forward as the people are coming. So good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you for the attendees. Welcome to the New York City Bar. Welcome to the African Affairs at the New York City Bar to discuss the subject on constitutionalism and presidential term limits, effects on democracy, governance, and security in Africa. I'd like to thank a lot the panelists, of course, and also our co-sponsoring committee. The co-sponsoring committee who are the Saris Van Center, the Election Law and International Human Rights at the City Bar. Now, to discuss this very important subject and very timely subject, I mean, our panelists, I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have a great list of panelists tonight. We have Dr. Dorina Bekoe, we have John Temin, we have Dr. Joseph Siegel, and also Dr. Fomoni. We're going to start with Dr. Dorina Bekoe. She's a research staff member at Africa program at the Institute for Defense Analysis. She was also an associate professor of conflict prevention, mitigation, and resolution at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies. Dr. Bekoe is an expert of Africa's political development, conflict resolution and peace building, peace agreements, electoral violence, gender and security, and institutional reform. Dr. Bekoe has edited Voting in Fear, Electoral Violence in Sub-Saharan Africa in 2012. Dr. Bekoe has also worked at the United States Institute for Peace and International Peace Institute. She holds a Bachelor in Economics from Franklin and Marshall College, an MS in Public Policy from Carnegie Mellon University, and a PhD in Public Policy from Harvard University. Dr. Bekoe's last appearance in Congress was before the House, the US House, about democratic backsliding in Sub-Saharan Africa, and this was last September. The next panelist is Dr. Joseph Siegel, who leads the Africa Center's research program, which produces the Center's Africa Security Brief, research paper, special reports, spotlights, and infographic series with the aim of generating policy-relevant analysis that contributes to addressing Africa's security challenges. Dr. Siegel's research interests include understanding the role of governance in advancing security and development, security trends in Africa, stabilizing of fragile states, democratic transition, and strengthening institutions of democratic accountability. He has also written widely for leading policy journals and newspapers, and is a regular media analyst. Dr. Siegel has published many articles, most recently, Circumvention of Term Limits Weakens Governance in Africa. And I'm sure we will be discussing a lot about that tonight. Prior to joining the Africa Center, Dr. Siegel was a Douglas Dillon Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, a senior research scholar at the University of Maryland Center for International and Security Studies, and a senior advisor for democratic governance at DAI. For more than a decade, he serves in various field capacities throughout Africa, as well as in Asia and in the Balkans, with the international NGO World Vision and a Peace Corps volunteer. Dr. Siegel holds a doctorate in international security and economic policy from University of Maryland School of Public Policy, and a master in agricultural economics with the emphasis on African food security from Michigan State University. Now we have our third panelist, Mr. John Temin, who is the director of the Africa program at Freedom House. He oversees the organization efforts to advance democracy and human rights across the continent. Mr. Temin was previously a member of the US Department of State's policy planning staff, where he provided strategic guidance and long-term thinking to Secretary of State. He also served as the director of the U.S. Institute of Peace Africa program, leading the institute's effort to help end conflict and prevent new violence. Prior experience includes serving as Fulbright Fellow in Ghana, visiting fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and term member of the Council on Foreign Relations. On September, Mr. Teming, as Dr. Bekowe, was also a testified person member before the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Subcommittee of Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organization, and the subject was democratic backsliding in sub-Saharan Africa, like I said earlier. Mr. Teming has written on Africa, conflicts, and governance issue in various news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Financial Times, Foreign Affairs, and Foreign Policy. Mr. Teming has also written for Lawfare about presidential term limits. The title was exactly When Leaders Override Term Limits, Democracy Grinds to a Halt. That was in October 2020. Finally, Dr. Christopher Fomenu. Dr. Fomenu is a Senior Associate and Regional Director for Central and West Africa at the National Democratic Institute, NDI. He organizes and advises international observation missions throughout Africa, including Benin, Cameroon, Central Africa, African Republic, Côte d'Ivoire, Ethiopia, Ghana, Liberia, Madagascar, Mali, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. He has also designed and supervised country-specific democracy support program with civic organization, political parties, and legislative body in many countries. Dr. Fomenu is a constant contact with head of states and government, cabinet ministers, elected official and political and civic leaders. He is a part of African Statesman Initiative, ASI, a program aiming at facilitating political transition in Africa by encouraging former democratic head of state to engage in humanitarian work, conflict mediation, public health, and other relevant issues. In 2019, Dr. Fomenu led the NDI with other partner organizations to host a 3-day summit in Niamey, Niger, on constitutional term limits. The summit aimed at addressing the erosion of the constitutional rule of law by extending and amending presidential term limit and possibly engage civil society and head of state to find a consensus on the matter. And also, there was just what I heard follow up today about the Constitutional Term Limit Summit that you did in Niamey, and hopefully Dr. Fomenu will entertain us about this subject tonight. Dr. Fomenu is an expert, of course, of democratization in Africa, and as such has appeared in major media, including CNN, BBC, News Hours, National Public Radio, Voice of America, Radio France International. He has also been quoted in major newspapers, including Los Angeles Times, New York Times, Washington Times, Le Monde, the International Herald Tribune. Dr. Fomenu has also published articles in academic journals on Africa politics and democratization. Dr. Fomenu has appeared in Congress, and the last one, including Dr. Bekowe, John Teming, was on democratic backsliding in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm glad they are all the two of them here tonight. And other appearances include the future of democracy in governance in Liberia back in 2017. This was also before the House, and another one in 2016 before the US Senate Committee on Foreign Relations was on terrorism and instability in sub-Saharan Africa, a good governance imperative. Dr. Fomenu holds a licence en droit from Yaoundé, from University of Yaoundé in Cameroon, a master degree LLM of international law from Harvard Law School, and a PhD in political science from Boston University. He is an adjunct faculty at the African Center for Strategic Studies and a former adjunct Professor of African Politics and Government at Georgetown University. Dr. Fomenu has also founded a non-profit organization that supports democracy and humanitarian causes in Cameroon. That was the bio of our great panelist. Very lengthy resume, we try to, to condense, but it's very important and very helpful for the conversation, and we are very pleased to have you here. Thank you for the audience to be here. And we're going to start because we have so many subjects to cover. The first question that I'd like to ask to the panelists would be, why should be a term limit in Africa? Why should it be? Because if you look recently, I mean, it's not, the term limit is not a problem, not only a problem for only Africa. This issue also involves other continents, but in Africa particularly, because this is what we're going to discuss tonight, why should it be a term limit in Africa? So I think that I'll ask the first to Dr. Bekoe.
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm quite honored to be among the panel. Why should we have term limits in Africa? After all, the argument is if you run for an election and the people vote for you, then you should, and you win, then you deserve, your position. But the issue is that if you don't have term limits, what's missing? What's missing is that there's no longer a check on individual power. Term limits help to institutionalize a peaceful transfer of power by also helping countries become more democratic. It increases the chances of a democratic turnover if you do put limits on how often a person can be in power. It allows for a broader, broader political participation, and in Africa in particular, lacking access to power has been one of the drivers of conflict. We can look at, Ethiopia, Cote d'Ivoire, Togo for examples of when people don't have access to power, how that can cause conflict. Even if you don't have a change in the ruling party, let's say the party keeps one party keeps winning, even though there are term limits, and you might have what someone might call a permanent opposition. Sometimes even that change in power might shift the fortunes of a party that might be always finding itself in opposition. So for example, in Mozambique, Frelimo has been in power since, since independence. But the permanent opposition, which would be Renamo, has found different levels of success depending on who's in power. So even if you don't have a change in political power, but you have a change in the presidency, in the executive, because of term limits, that can also perhaps lower tension. It can go the other way as well, but that political change, that turnover is important in providing stability and predictability in politics. So I'll leave it there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. What about Mr. Temin? What do you think about why should they have a term limit in Africa?
Thanks, Doris, and let me reiterate Doreena's thanks for pulling us all together for this important conversation. I'll make two main points. One, and I know you mentioned this off the top, but just to reemphasize that there's nothing particularly African about this problem. And it does sometimes get portrayed that way because there are a lot of cases, relatively speaking, of leaders who seek to evade term limits in Africa, and there's a fair number of leaders who've been around for many decades in Africa who become somewhat caricatures of themselves. But these issues come up in every region of the world. And in fact, Latin America has had many instances of term limits changing, in part because some of those constitutions started off with one-term limits. But you see it in Eurasia, you see it in Asia, you see it to some extent in the Middle East. Let's keep in mind too that two of the largest countries in the world, China and Russia, have recently gone through their own term limit changes in various ways. As to the importance of term limits, I think a lot of this discussion often gravitates towards the negatives of when term limits are evaded, when leaders stay in office for years and sometimes decades on end. But what I think that obscures is the benefit of leadership rotation. And I think that is just as important a component of the conversation, because leadership rotation refreshes governments, it refreshes institutions, it allows new generations of leaders to rise through the ranks and to exercise their leadership muscles. It provides opportunities for opposition parties to come into office. And so I think that's the piece of this that I'd like to see emphasized more in the global discourse. Is that any institution in any country, United States, elsewhere, does need that kind of refreshing, because things can get stale. And the rotation that comes through enforced term limits is one really important source of that refreshing.
Thank you. What about you, Dr. Stigl? Why should it be term limits? You wrote about that.
Yeah, thanks, Doris, and thank you and New York City Bar Association for the invitation to participate tonight. I think it's important to first set the context a little bit that, term limits is particularly important in Africa because of the legacy of really a super dominant executive that has been, the characteristic governance model in Africa really since independence. And so lacking, strong democratic legacies, there haven't been very rich checks and balances. And so what we saw in the post-independence period was leaders really governing without restraints. And this led to, the so-called big man rule, or, less diplomatically, dictators for life, where you had leaders who would be in power indefinitely, and there just weren't means of reeling them in. So the movement towards democracy in the 1990s, opened up a raft of reforms, and one of these was the importance of term limits. And the idea was, as Dorina and John were saying, you want to regularize the succession. You want to reduce the unpredictability, the instability in this process. But you want more transparency. You want some rotation, and so there was a big push to get term limits instituted across the continent. And we've seen this has had effect. So, this is more than just a theoretical conversation. In countries where the term limits have been upheld, the average time in office for leaders is less than 4 years. In places where leaders have been able to evade term limits, or there aren't term limits, the average is 17 years in office. And this has other implications with regards to corruption. Leaders where they've been able to evade term limits are in the bottom quintile of Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index, about 157th on average of 180 some countries. That's a full 57 countries below the median for countries where leaders are respecting term limits. So there are important governance implications, and there are also important stability implications. So of the 14 conflicts in Africa today, 11 are in countries where leaders don't adhere to term limits. And over 90% of the internally displaced and refugees in Africa come from countries without term limits. So there's higher levels of instability in countries that don't respect term limits. And so this has a destabilizing effect. And it reflects what Dorina is saying, that if people don't see fair and systematic means of changing their leaders, then those tensions, those frustrations come out in different ways.
Thank you. And Dr. Fomenu, you want to weigh on that, since you have the summit in Niamey about the term limit?
Sure. Thank you, Doris. And let me join my colleagues in thanking the New York City Bar Association for this invitation to speak to all of you on this extremely important topic for Africa and Friends of Africa. I will pick up where Dr. Siegel left off by touching a little bit on the historical perspective, to say that lest we forget, in 1960, between 1960 and 1965, when many of African countries achieved independence, these countries achieved independence for the most part as pluralistic societies. Political parties were young, but they were flourishing. And there was competition for office, there was competition for ideas, and there was a lot of investment in the people of those countries to make those countries become viable nation states. Now, from 1966 upwards to close to 1990, we saw the emergence of one-man rule, the big man rule in Africa, where military regimes became the order of the day, and one-party states that didn't allow for political pluralism and didn't allow for civil society to exist became the order of the day. And in that difficult context, you then had leaders who were presidents for life. You stayed in State House until you were toppled by the military or you died in office. And in fact, by 1990, when democratization, the third wave of democratization began to take effect across the African continent, there had only been three African leaders who had graciously relinquished political power out of their own volition, who had term limited themselves. And that was Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Amadou Ahidjo of Cameroon, and Sédar Senghor of Senegal. The rest of the presidents were sit-tight presidents. And if you look at what Africa looked like before the wave of democratization began, it was an empty shell for the most part, in terms of these autocratic leaders, long-serving leaders, sitting atop very dysfunctional societies, almost dead and not vibrant societies. Fortunately, in the last 2 or 3 decades, as democratization has begun to take root, we now have close to 40 former African leaders or African leaders who formerly served as heads of states in their respective countries. And over 25 of them were very instrumental in putting in place the democratization process that allowed for these countries to have new institutions, new constitutions, which for the most part put in place a limitation on presidential terms. The second point I want to make also touches on the introduction that Dr. Siegel made with regards to stability, because now that we all and Africans are putting a premium on both democratic governance and development going hand in hand, and with the impetus that's put on private sector investment as a motto to drive economic activity in various countries. These are all potential partners that require a lot of stability in the body politic. And one way to make these countries attractive is to expunge the elements of instability and unpredictability that may depend on the well-being of one individual or on his situation of health or on his age, but create a situation that is propelled by well-known, accepted, transparent, understood principles, one of which is the principle of limitation of presidential terms. That way, investors have a sense of when there will be a renewal of political leadership in a country and how that gets to happen. And the process of renewal becomes such a normality or a situation of normalcy that when Africans go into elections, it's not a life or death issue. And my third and last point, very briefly, with regards to term limits, is that it's also become an instrument to help equalize or stabilize power relationships on the continent. Let's not forget that Africa is the youngest continent on Earth, on the face of the globe, and that of its 1.4 billion inhabitants, 75% are 35 years and younger. And in many of these countries, there's always a disconnect between the aspirations of this younger generation, their eagerness to engage in the political process, and the age of long-serving leaders. And so if you don't create an opportunity for this youthful population, energetic, talented, well-educated population to grow and emerge on the political scene, then you end up sucking up all the oxygen that's required to make African countries viable. The two longest serving presidents in the world are on the African continent, and that's Obiang Nguema, who has been in power for 41 years, and Paul Biya of Cameroon, who has been in power for 38 years. Both of them are in their 80s, and the populations, the average age in both countries is less than 20 years of age. And so you can just see the instability in that equation in terms of the government's inability to enact policies that respond to the interests of the majority of Africans. And until we reverse that trend, until we put in place these kinds of mechanisms, that imbalance would contribute to a dysfunctioning state of affairs in many of those countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fumenu. And to jump on that, it's true that, I mean, these are long-serving head of state. So how can the population reverse that, even though we see that there's election each year, how many elections there are, but it doesn't seem that election have a result that probably the population wants, and election also often tends to violence and death. And it's something that Dr. Beko, maybe you want to discuss about why is so much violence all the time when there's election? If you think that the election, they make election, but they don't, but we already know the results, and we want to understand that.
Yes, so just a little background on elections and violence in Africa. I think a lot of the violence that makes the news are what we hear with, you know, Kenya and Cote d'Ivoire, you know, these really very high numbers of violence and fatalities. But what the research tells us is that about 65% of the elections in Africa are violent, but most are not of the kind that kind of make the news. You know, the Cote d'Ivoire and Ethiopia and Nigeria. Most of it is violence that normally actually doesn't involve fatalities. But more worrying is that democracy has not made elections less violent on the continent. And I think that was part of the expectation, is if you have you know, a democratic system with the regular holding of elections, that you would see a decrease in violence. And in fact, it's been quite steady. So the question is, why does it persist? And one other point to make before I address why we think it persists is that pre-election violence is the dominant form of violence. About 95% of all elections, of all violence happens before the election. Post-election violence is a lot rarer, but it actually is much deadlier. So a lot of the examples I cited before, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, that was those elections, the violence in that election, those elections happened after the vote. Before the election, the perpetrators are trying to influence the election, and then after the election, it's much harder to do, but they are trying to change the election or change the result, and that seems to cause a lot more violence. When do we see it? When do we see violence happening? We see it when there are poor institutional environments, so weak electoral commission, biased judiciary. Violence is also used very strategically by political actors. So one of the things that I have found is that violence is not random. It's never really a big surprise to see it. Incumbents are the ones that are most responsible for the violence as they try to cling on to power. There's fear of losing. We see more violence in presidential than legislative elections. We see more violence in what we call first past the post, which is just getting majority of versus a proportional representation. So those are the conditions under which we see violence on the continent. And the other thing I want to add is that a lot of the violence will reflect underlying conflict systems. And so we'll see violence that happens to recur in the same region, in the same country. So the election kind of brings out a lot of this animosity that might have been dormant, in the intervening years.
Right. Thank you. So about this violence, we also see that there's the international partners, and also I would like to remind the audience, feel free to participate because we'd like to have your questions. So there's a Q&A for the audience where you'll be able to have your questions, and the panelists will see the question and reply to you. So in jump on this violence, Mr. Teming, what would you say that the international partner of when there's those violence that sometimes are very hard to see, what can the international partner do and what have they done? And I know that there have been some instances where, for instance, countries have not only made communiques, but have took some sanction against some countries. Is that something that is something recommendable, or is something that the country have to deal with themselves?
Thanks, Doris. Well, let me address what I think US policy in particular should be concerning term limits, and perhaps other countries' policy as well. I think that we should think about leaders who change a constitution or change the rules to benefit themselves. We should think about that more like a coup against the Constitution, because they are evading the rules in order to retain power. And that's pretty close to what an actual coup is. And so I think there should be some policy responses to that. US law states that when there's a military coup, many forms of US assistance to a particular country are automatically suspended. And the African Union automatically suspends a country when a military coup happens. That happened earlier this year in Mali, for example. And I think that when a leader changes the rules to benefit himself or herself, there should be a broad review of US assistance to that country. That should be an automatic thing, and that's something the State Department does somewhat frequently. There should be that across the board review of assistance. And then there should be a conversation about which pieces of that assistance are suspended and are affected by this decision by the leader in that country. But the key there is to make that automatic, or at least that review automatic, so that there isn't a whole lot of wiggle room for
Discretion.
the US to sort of fudge it, because there's sometimes a temptation to do so. And so that there's an expectation that if a leader chooses to do that, he or she knows that there's going to be this consequence. As with so many policies, things like this are much more effective if they're multilateral. So it would be the one thing, if the US does it, it would be much more effective. If multiple countries were to take that approach and say that when these coups against the Constitution happen, we're all going to look at our assistance together and we're going to make cuts accordingly. That would send a preemptive message to leaders who are considering this, that there are going to be real consequences if that's the path they choose to go down.
Thank you. Yes, because we don't see that there's this, I mean, it's a political will, I guess, to have that implemented, because the policy is not done across the board. And some countries you have a broad condemnation, and others there's nothing really. Dr. Stigl, what would you say about the political violence that you have seen when political leaders change the constitution? And because you insisted on security and the effect on terms limit.
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind that nearly all of Africa's conflicts are internal conflicts, civil conflicts. And that in itself reflects a breakdown in the political order of these societies, that there aren't political systems where people can express themselves, disagree, mobilize supporters, organize a political agenda, and vote in a fair way. That those rights of expression and assembly and political organization are denied. And so, the figure I gave that, of Africa's 14 conflicts, 11 are in countries where leaders aren't upholding term limits. That's hardly a coincidence. In nearly all of those countries, leaders have, manipulated the system so that they could stay in office. And we've seen increasingly that opposition will mobilize to try to prevent the evading of term limits. There have been massive protests in countries like Togo and Guinea, which had elections this year, and where the leaders were trying to stay in power. And yet, those concerns are brushed aside, and the leaders were able to plow forward and stay in power. So I think, my point is, there are many Africans, in fact, polls show, vast majority of Africans want to see stronger democratic institutions in place. And when they try to assert those democratic rights and they're not upheld, then ultimately, or eventually, you'll see people's frustrations boil over, and people conclude that there's no other way to change their leaders than through violence. And so there's a very strong relationship between length of time in office for a leader and political instability, length of time in office and corruption. And so, the institution of term limits is like a release of a pressure cooker. It's a way of allowing leaders to move on, allowing for some of these political pressures to drop down, allowing for some competition, some rotation, and in the process, leading to better governance, leading to better development outcomes, and avoiding conflict.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dr. Siegel. And jumping on that, Dr. Fomenu, talking about violence, is there a relationship with the crisis that we have right now in Cameroon with the term limit? You were reminding that Mr. Biya is one of the oldest leaders in the continent.
Well, I think there is a correlation. And before I zero in on the specific case of Cameroon, let me also say that there's a correlation between violence around elections and the perceptions that citizens have about the relevance of that particular election in their well-being and in their livelihood. If people know that if they lose an election, they're going to have another shot in 4 years or in 5 years, and the powers of incumbency will not be played to their disadvantage, they're more likely to accept the outcome, even in a close election, than they would be if an election is presented to them as a first election and only election. Because if you lose, either you end up in jail or that incumbent is going to continue to take advantage of incumbency to be in power forever. And that explains why, the disaffection from political engagement that we see in some countries. That explains the gap between the leadership and the rest of the populace. But if there are term limits, then if people disagree with the policy of a leader, they're going to wait until the elections. And even if that leader wins re-election, people would know that by the next election, that specific leader is no longer going to be in place. And that would help absorb some of the tensions that my co-panelists referred to. The second point I want to make very briefly ties up with what Mr. Timin just said with regards to the role of partners. And I would say that at the same time as the partners need to harmonize their posture vis-a-vis constitutionalism and issues of presidential term limits, the African organizations that are already in place also need to step up and take responsibility. Because for the African Union, for example, the Charter on Democracy, Elections, and Governance that was adopted in 2007 has some very progressive provisions that say that a leader who manipulates the constitution to stay in office, as John said, should be viewed as a leader who staged a coup. That's very clearly stated in the African Union Charter. The unfortunate thing is that the implementation of the Charter, the African Union is not as strong and as firm with regards to those civilian leaders as it is with coup makers, with military coup makers. And I think that's something that we should also be calling the African Union to say, you have this instrument, use it and prove that you really mean it. Give it some content. It's already there. We saw that, for example, in 2015, in West Africa, of the 15 countries that make up the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, 13 of them by 2015 had presidents that had been in power for less than 10 years. And 13 of them at that time were all very committed to making sure that they respected and served for more than 2 terms of 5 years each. The ECOWAS came very close to amending its protocols on governance to include a specific provision that would apply to all 15 member states. But that issue was blocked by two countries at the time, Togo and the Gambia under Yahya Jammeh. And today, people look back at West Africa and say, if ECOWAS had put in place that provision, it would have helped preempt some of the backsliding that we're now seeing, where the possibility of amending the constitution to stay in power is coming back to be the norm rather than the exception. And then the last thing with Cameroon, as in response to your question, when people have a president who is 86 years old or 87 years old, who has been in power for 38 years and 7 years as prime minister before that, so a cumulative total of 45 years in the highest positions in the land, they don't see a future for themselves. And they say to themselves, if he stays in office until something happens or nature takes its course, and then a younger leader comes out from the same mold, and that younger leader takes on another 40 years, then their generation really doesn't belong and isn't going to have an opportunity to influence policy formulation and isn't going to have their voices heard or their collective voice heard. And then that contributes to that feeling of not belonging that can then spur other movements, including the urge for decentralized government, and even in some cases, as we now see in Cameroon, unfortunately, a huge minority of the population, or a population that represents 20% of the country's total, wanting to go back to their historical roots and say they don't belong here, because in the past 60 years since independence, the country has been governed by only 2 presidents. And those presidents didn't give opportunities for a competitive political process. So you bring up a very good example, and it's a case study that illustrates many of the points that we've made thus far.
Thank you, Dr. Fomenu. I have a question from the Q&A here. There's Sonny who's asking, what about where there are competing foreign interests in African election democracies? And say, it mean where China, Russia, or some other country get involved and dilute the democracy? If somebody has an answer to the question?
Yeah, if nobody, I can volunteer if
Okay.
If my colleagues permit.
No, please do.
Yes, we have to recognize that today there are a number of illiberal forces also interested in Africa for different reasons that impede the ability of nascent democracies in Africa to consolidate some of the gains that have been made. And amongst the superpowers that you mentioned, I think I see them as operating under with different incentives or different impetus. Of course, nobody wants Africa not to trade or do business with the rest of the world. Nobody's going to say to Africa, you can only trade with the Western countries, or you can only trade with specific countries in the West and not with others, or not with countries from the former Eastern Bloc. But one must recognize that many or some of these superpowers are not helping. I take Russia, for example. I would say Russia is an exporter of bad practices, not necessarily the best practices in terms of democratic governance, transparency, and accountability, but it's, for the most part, invested in just having a seat at the table in various African countries. On the other hand, I think China is probably playing a more unconstructive role with regards to the specific issue of elections and democratic governance. Because not only does China want a seat at the table, but China seems to want to promote a narrative that says illiberal democracy or the lack of democracy is okay. And look at us, we've done it this far, or thus far, we've come thus far, without any political pluralism and without any level of electoral competition. And so you can do it. And that's the worry that I have. And about 2 or 3 years ago, the Chinese Communist Party sponsored a very high-profile conference in Dar es Salaam for ruling parties of 44 African countries. So it didn't matter the ideology of or the policy of the party, it just mattered that they were the ruling party. And I'm still, and maybe the researchers on the panel would help us, but I'm still trying to figure out whether there's a direct correlation between what happened at that conference 2 or 3 years ago and the level of intolerance, growing intolerance, and sometimes violence that we're now seeing by ruling parties against opposition parties and their supporters. And I think that's a cause for concern. Also, we must acknowledge that, some of the Western countries that are established democracies do not also put a premium on democracy the way we would expect. As if to say to the populations of Africa, we love democracy and will work to defend and sustain it for our people in our home countries, but we will treat with your leaders, irrespective of whether they do the same things for you as Africans. And I think there's some conversations that need to be had around that. Thank you.
Yeah.
If I can jump in, Doris,
Sure.
just to elaborate on Dr. Fumunia's points. We are working in a different environment now where there are competing global models for governance, and both China and Russia are advocating different versions of an authoritarian model that they believe and want to export in different ways. And so there isn't sort of just this widely accepted norm that democracy is the preferred system. But I think beyond just sort of ideological battle out there, we're seeing some active support to prop up some of these incumbents that Dr. Fumunia has referred to. And in the case of Russia, a very active effort to undermine even the concept of term limits. So, Guinea just had elections earlier this year, and the Russian ambassador in Conakry was very forward in saying, well, constitutions are made to be changed, and why would you want to change a leader if he's doing a good job? Of course, Russia has very significant mining interest in Guinea and a close relationship with the leader there, Alpha Conde. In the Central African Republic, there's an election coming up December 27th, 10 days from now. And again, Russia's been very active in the politics of CAR. And very blunt in their support for President Touadéra there. Again, they're a very close business and financial interest for Russia. Russia has actually the national security advisor in CAR is Russian. There's Russian mercenaries in CAR. And so very much they have a vested interest in keeping him in power and are blatantly doing so. We referred to the coup in Mali earlier, and it didn't get a lot of attention. But when the coup occurred, the day of the coup, there were hundreds of Malians on the streets of Bamako with Russian flags and with Russian placards, thanking Russia for their help in toppling the democratically elected government there, and this had come on the backs of a disinformation campaign that had been fomenting a lot of the unrest against the Keita government in Mali. So I think the question is a really good one that we can't just look inward at the domestic dynamics, which of course are important and the most important element, but there are international actors who have other vested interest and who are trying to tilt the scales of these outcomes.
Thank
Of course,
you.
can I jump in with a related point as well, which is that the strongest argument in favor of term limits is that Africans very clearly support them. There's survey data out there from the Afrobarometer organization, which is really the gold standard of public opinion surveying throughout Africa, which broadly shows about 75% support for 2 term limits across Africa. In fact, in some countries that recently violated those term limits, Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire in particular, it shows even greater than 75% support. So, I think that as we are thinking through the policies and as we are talking about how do you articulate this, for me, that's the fundamental argument here, is that this is what many publics desire. I saw the question about sort of, how do we justify this given that Mayor Bloomberg changed the rules to the 3rd term. You look at Angela Merkel in Germany, who's been in office for quite a while. There are always going to be situations like that. Nobody's arguing that sort of, we necessarily have high ground on these issues. But it is the case that there's public support for this kind of rotation in Africa. And that's, what we should be getting behind.
And yes, it's true that a lot of people say, okay, a term limit, but I mean, it's not only in Africa that we see people want to extend the terms, because there's Michael Bloomberg, I mean, which is really like the example that everybody cited in New York, that happened right in New York City. And the other question that the attendee asked is, what is the guarantee that the term limit will bring stability or will bring, better governance? Because there are some countries where there's some term limit, but is it sure that the citizen, the population believe that the elections are free and fair?
Let me just jump in quickly, Doris. I think, in terms of the guarantee, there aren't any guarantees. This is just a mechanism. It's another check and balance that helps to lead to better governance by preventing the ossification of governance systems. It prevents patronage networks from building up and perpetuating power systems that benefit a few at the expense of the many. On their own, they're not going to change things. You're going to need other checks and balances. You're going to need to have other initiatives that lead to better outcomes. But it's a pretty central change because so much of power in Africa is centralized, and it's centralized within the executive branch. And there's an overlap between political power and economic power. And so term limits is a way to try to break that out. And I think we have to, again, keep in mind where Africa is coming from. Africa is at the early stages of democratizing. And in some cases, it's the early stages of building these states. And so because you're starting from an unbalanced institutional environment where so much power has been vested in executive, term limits are particularly important in Africa. In other more mature democracies, you can manage without term limits because there are other checks and balances in place. And maybe at some point, that'll be the case in Africa where term limits aren't as important. But right now, where we're still establishing and fighting to get these norms, they're particularly important. And that's why they matter at this point in time, especially in Africa.
Okay, so term limit would be like at least a starting point to have a little bit of check and balance, governance, and also stability, I guess. And I have a question of a panelist was asking, why is the US doesn't lead the way? A coalition of the US leading the way, who's setting the tone for a good example. Dr. Koe, maybe you want to jump in that? why don't you think that the US doesn't enforce or lead the way in democratic institution for Africa, for instance, since we were talking about competition with China, Russia?
Well, I mean, we are talking about a particular point in time. I think, historically, the US backs, more democratic regimes. And I mean, there are other ways in which, the United States is supportive of democratic ideals. Support to civil society is really important. So, in some countries where, you have civil society that is particularly strong, they can roll back attempts at these power grabs. So, for example, in Senegal, not recently, but maybe in 2012, when Abdoulaye Wade was really trying to change the constitution to for a third term, or to get, guarantee his win, the Yanamar movement, which was really just the youth, was one of the ways in which they were able to push back on that. And other, so, support to civil society is an important way, I think, in which the US helps to further democratic ideals. Support to the media are also important tools in which you can have that kind of pressure from below to kind of preempt, the power of incumbency, which is, particularly strong. So it's sometimes other kind of pressure points, in society that that help sustain democracy.
Thank you, Dr. Buckley. I have a question from Elizabeth, who's asking, even assuming public support for term limits, how can the public support be effectuated when elections are not free and fair? Somebody wants to jump into that?
Yeah,
maybe.
I can respond.
What about you?
Okay, thank you. Good coincidence. I think like minds think alike. We have seen African countries in which the population has been able to force through an outcome which went along the lines of reinforcing term limits. And we saw that in Senegal, for example, in 2012, when President Abdoulaye Wade, who was elected in 2000, along the way amended the constitution and felt that the clock needed to start not from the day he was sworn into office, but from the day on which the new constitution was amended, and that he therefore had the right to seek a third term. And there was a popular citizen-driven movement led by civil society and organizations such as Yanamar, which is an expression Senegalese to say, I've had enough, enough is enough, which really speaks to the issue of term limits, that was able to mobilize a broad-based coalition of citizens, civil society organizations, and political parties to vote Wade out. And so he had the possibility of participating in that process. The elections were even organized by the Ministry of Interior, but because the population was so mobilized to make sure that their voices were heard, they were able to vote Wade out of office. So that's a good example. We also saw in Burkina Faso that Blaise Compaoré, who first came into power as a military major through a coup and had served for 27 years, kept shifting the constitution to give himself more time in office. In about 2013, the people of the people of Burkina Faso determined that they had had enough and were not going to accept for the constitution to be amended again to give Blaise Compaoré the possibility of running for office. And the citizen uprising was so strong that Blaise Compaoré then felt compelled to escape from the capital and to find his way by road into neighboring Côte d'Ivoire. And that has given an opportunity for Burkina Faso to regain its momentum as a pluralistic society with term limits that hopefully will be respected by the leaders of the day. Let me just make one last point on the question that was posed earlier about how do you guarantee that through term limits, you don't end up with bad leaders? Are you better off with a quote unquote good leader who serves for life, or multiple bad leaders who come through, or multiple leaders who come through, some good, some bad, but interspersed for a period of time? And the examples I always give to people is in the United States, yes, it had to take, after Franklin, FDR, is it what, the 17th Amendment, or, to kind of limit the number of terms that a president could serve. But remember that if George Washington hadn't voluntarily said, I'd serve my 4 years and I'll leave, he wouldn't have created that foundation that made it easier for other presidents not to seek to perpetuate themselves in office. And eventually it became a routine, that a norm that was accepted or respected, even before it became institutionalized and written as an amendment to the Constitution. And when you look at South Africa today, for all of its faults within the ANC and all of the wrangling back and forth, since South Africa gained independence in 1994, since apartheid collapsed in 1992 and Nelson Mandela was elected president of a free democratic South Africa in 1994, South Africa is already at its fourth president, where other African countries are not. And people look at South Africa and they say the reason why leaders relinquish power when they're no longer popular or viewed as competent, even within their own political parties, is because the father of the new South Africa, Nelson Mandela, looked everyone in the eye and said, even when people were pleading that, Mr. President, you could be president for life, and nobody would have disputed that title from Nelson Mandela. But he looked South Africans in the eyes and said, I'll serve one term and I'll leave the spot for the next generation of leaders. And because he did that, it's going to become extremely important and extremely difficult for any further South African leader to want to perpetuate themselves in office. So leadership matters, and I think the leaders that set the tone make it, not everybody is going to perform at the same level, but the existence of that possibility also gives you the ability to vote out an incumbent and inefficient president. So if you don't have that facility and somebody gets in and he may start good, but then he may become an autocrat as he goes on, but you no longer have the possibility of taking him out of office. And we just, as Doris said, we just finished a 3-day conference on this same issue with over 2,000 participants across the African continent, from civil society, political leadership, political parties. We had the former president of Malawi, the former prime minister of Senegal. We had elders from the Africa Forum, which is a collection of former African heads of states. We had the Kofi Annan Foundation, which is a group of elderly statesmen and women. And this conversation is also taking place across the continent. And one of the things that was said by Professor Yash Gay of Kenya, an established law professor, who is the founding director of the Katiba Institute in Kenya, that has been involved in multiple constitutional commissions, not just in Kenya, but in countries as diverse as Iraq, Papua New Guinea, in Asia, and across the African continent. He said, there's an incentive in winning an election. There's an incentive in staying in power. But if leaders knew that they were term limited, they probably would focus on governing and governing properly so they would have a legacy even when they're still alive. And I think that's what is lacking, or that's what makes the difference between the countries that have presidential term limits and the countries that do not. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fomenu. We have a question. I think this is for Mr. Temming about US policy. So we have Chantal's question saying, is there something that can be done at international level to put in place a check and balance? And also that's also more or less the same that Janice is asking. How effective has the US been in its support for democratic regime throughout Africa? And yeah, I think we can condense also another question in the same, Côte d'Ivoire and Guinea. It does not look like the US is applying this policy uniformly, said Philippe. Case in point, there was a clear violation at the constitution in Côte d'Ivoire and Guinea very recently, but yet we did not see a clear response from the US addressing this coup against the constitution of these countries.
Yeah, and I agree with, I think, the implication of the question in that I would have liked to see the US do more in those two cases of Guinea and Cote d'Ivoire. There have been some, reasonably strong statements issued, but it's only been statements. There hasn't been any real action to back that up. And I think leaders around the world know that they can easily deflect statements. They can't as easily deflect actions such as or sanctions or those sorts of things. It's no secret, I think, that promoting these values abroad has not been a focus for the current US administration. We'll see what happens with the next one. Nor has, lots of US administrations have been inconsistent in their policy implication. That's not a new thing. And we're never going to reach perfect consistency because there are competing interests in US policymaking across the board, but we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. What I think is important is that US policymakers and policymakers elsewhere take a longer term view of this issue and understand that when leaders stay in office for so long, when they change the rules to benefit themselves, it really does have this long-term corrosive effect that everybody pays the price for later on. I think we have lots of evidence to show that leaders who stay in power for so long, their second decade in power is rarely better than the first, and the third and even fourth decades can be pretty bad. And that the longer they stay in power, the more difficult and potentially violent the transition is. And so many of these leaders who stay in office for so long really do nothing to prepare for what comes next. And if it is some sort of preparation, it's usually for a family member to take over or someone else who's going to protect them. So, the challenge with US policymaking is to, in my view, more appropriately weigh those long-term costs against short-term interests, because too often the short-term interests win the day, and those short-term interests have to do with stability and have to do with the relationships that we've developed with certain leaders and some of the benefits of those relationships. In Africa, one instance is on the security front. I'll give the example of President Museveni in Uganda, who's been in office for, I believe, 36 years or so, and has at times been a good security partner for the United States in what Ugandan forces have done in Somalia and chasing down the Lord's Resistance Army over the years. But that has really blinded US policy to many of the failures of his leadership otherwise, and the situation there is becoming increasingly dire. So my desire for a long time has been for the US to get over some of those short-term interests and see the value long-term in regular leadership rotation, and again, in the positive benefits of that leadership rotation as well. So, and there are many good US policymakers who get that and who fight for that, but there's also a lot of competing interests within the policymaking apparatus that sometimes work in the other direction.
Can I just add something to that? I think one of the other things that we see is that third terms or more are arrived at in I guess maybe trickier ways, you know, either through a referendum. And so that becomes a lot harder to argue against. We just saw that recently in Guinea, that allowed Condé to, I think, even seek a fourth term with this referendum. We saw something similar in Rwanda. So we're seeing leaders kind of take different routes to this third term issue. And, you know, it might be perhaps effective if you had the African Union or one of the regional economic communities have a clear, not definition, but a clear framework as to, you know, what the vision for democratic norms is on the continent. I mean, in Cote d'Ivoire, the third term was arrived at a kind of a similar sort of backdoor, with the prime minister, the candidate dying unexpectedly just a couple months before the election, and that you know, allowed Ouattara to run for a third term that had been prepared a couple of years earlier through, you know, a referendum on the Constitution. And so there are, you know, the routes to the third term are becoming, you know, a lot murkier. And it seems that it's kind of ripe for the continent's institutions to have a clearer vision on, you know, what exactly are we talking about when we talk about unconstitutional changes in government? Under what conditions might we suspend? Because, you know, even with countries having, you know, countries undergoing coups, they kind of, you'll see the leaders twist themselves into, you know, saying how something that looks like a coup is not really a coup because they're afraid of that backlash. So how can we create an environment where that same resistance to being seen as taking on a third term, you know, is created?
All right, so if I can jump in as well. So I think it's a really important point that we aren't in a sort of a static period. We're actually in a period of decline in upholding these norms. And specifically with regards to term limits, you know, since 2015, there are 13 African countries that have evaded term limits. In some cases, it's the second or third time that they've evaded. But you know, that's a major acceleration this last 5 years. And as you know, Chris alluded to, the regional bodies, ECOWAS and the African Union, have been less robust, let's say, in their responses and holding these leaders accountable. And there's been a vacuum internationally for, you know, a strong support for democratic norms and values. And so what's been filling this vacuum? It's been a return to, you know, strongman rule, and backed up by some of these other external actors. And so I think it's important to capture that we're in a really fragile moment right now for democratic norms that have been built for the last couple decades, because there's a real pushback. And unless that vacuum at the regional and international level comes in to help support the domestic reformers, we'll continue to see a deterioration in that. And
there's also the fact when during the Congress about backsliding democratic values, I mean, the Congresswoman was referring to the US, because there's also what she stated as a backsliding of democratic norms in the US was also helping the fact that you see a backsliding in other places. That includes Africa. There's another question here that I see. how could the African diaspora in the United States connect better with the US policymaker to help push for some swift democratic changes in the continent? Somebody wants to?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, I see certain diaspora groups that have been quite effective in their advocacy. The Ethiopian diaspora community, which is large in the U.S., has been very vocal over the years. It is divided now, reflecting some of the divisions in the country. But over the years, it's had a pretty significant voice, and obviously that, is especially the case in constituencies where there's a large population and really trying to get those members to engage. I think what members are looking for is real policy options and real ideas that they can advance. So I see a lot of diaspora groups and others sort of talking about how bad a certain situation is, and that's helpful. But what is even more helpful is really the ideas on what to do about it, and sort of that more nuanced analysis of where things can go from here.
Okay. Thank you. These questions, I think, about with respect to civilian uprising, what are your thoughts on companies that manipulate data, for instance, Cambridge Analytics, to sway public opinion for or against political candidates? What can we do going forward to prevent or minimize such distortion campaign that represent an existing threat to democracy, essentially? Somebody wants to jump into that? Because
yeah, I'll start on that one. Yes, this issue of disinformation campaigns is a growing problem on the continent, and Cambridge Analytica is one example of that. I think we need to keep in mind that often these privately supported campaigns are working at the behest of incumbent governments. Again, trying to cloud up the information environment and put out false information about their opposition. And democracy doesn't work well if you don't have access to information and trusted information. And so these campaigns are doubly dangerous. One is they're trying to distort the truth for a particular campaign, but they're also undermining trust in the democratic process. And a part of the objective here is if you create disillusionment among a population, if people believe there's no difference whether you vote or don't vote, or whether it's a democracy or authoritarian system, then it's a lot easier for these leaders and sometimes with their external partners to sustain that hold on power. So this is it's a big challenge. It's a challenge around the world, and Africa has a lot of improvement it needs to make in terms of identifying disinformation campaigns, building up capacity for fact checking and exposing these campaigns, educating the public, and then holding these groups and those behind them responsible. There has to be some cost to these groups. Otherwise, they'll continue to do that. Now, this is often there's often an international dimension to it. Again, serving other vested interests, and so it's a case where there needs to be a teaming up of democratic reformers within Africa and regional international actors who can provide some of the capacity and some of the clout for increasing the cost when things like this get exposed. But the first step is to talk about it, to get it out and open, and then try to do the forensic tracing of what's going on. And some of that has been started, but there's a long way to go.
Definitely. The question here asking, isn't it not the interest for democratic country to have a man of power in Africa countries that will keep supplying mineral resources as well? As we all have noticed, the major lack of governance in countries where there's a man in power and there is still the business going on with democratic countries. I guess that the question is, what's the interest for a country like US to have democracy in Africa while having a strong man, corrupt strong man or something who stay in power for 40 years will supply all the mineral for free? I mean, almost free. So long as you don't disturb his long reign. What would you say, Dr. Fomonu? You are mute.
I would say, thank you. I would say that for some of us who have been around, we remember the debt crisis, the African debt crisis of the 70s, when a lot of lenders had made monies available to African governments who at the end couldn't pay for them because they'd invested the monies in elephant projects. And I think that it's always that risk when the investment climate or the commercial relationships are established based on loyalty to one individual, as opposed to those relationships being defined and guaranteed and protected by instruments that can endure beyond that individual. So if the choice is to do business with an autocrat because you can extract all the benefits, there's a downside to it, because the day that the autocrat is no longer there, there's no guarantee that the next autocrat will be willing to give you the dividends or access to the dividends that are coming out of your business. On the other hand, if you're doing business in a country that has got the principles of rule of law, the independence of the judiciary, labor laws that are respected, then ultimately, if it's a well thought out investment, that investment is going to pay dividends irrespective of who is in State House. And I think one of the major concerns across Africa today is the secrecy, the opacity that surrounds some of the deals, especially in the area of mineral extraction, some of the deals that African countries are signing with Chinese companies, that there's no transparency in those contracts. And so nobody knows what the terms are. Nobody knows what the benefits are to the country and how that impacts the public budget, the public coffers, as opposed to what goes to the specific individual to help them stay in office. And so I think we need to reinforce the narrative that when there's transparency and good governance, everybody benefits, and everybody benefits for the long haul. When there is opacity and personality-driven or personalized relationships, some people may benefit in the short term, but there will come a time of reckoning where even the initial benefits may no longer be available.
Somebody wants to add a comment? Dr. Bekoe, maybe?
Yeah, I can add something to that. The other thing to keep in mind, in addition, to everything that Chris said, is that, democratic countries are more stable. And so in terms of, partnership, I think it would be in the interest of, the broader international community, although I think the questioner seemed to have been talking about the West versus Africa. So, it's in the interest of Western governments to have, democratic African countries. They're more stable, less prone to conflict. And so in the long run, that's the better partnership. And even in countries like the DRC, where some might have benefited, because in a situation of war, you don't have contracts that can be properly enforced. You have very weak institutions. The gain is quite short term. So it's in the interest of everyone to have more democratic states.
Thank you. Also, there's this question here, that's the chat, if I can open it. So Frank asked, how do you assess the constitutional backslide in Benin and constitutional amendment to limit opposition and amend term limits? I guess the question would be what happened in Benin, and also the fact that there's the term limit, but they prevent people from even voting, So how would you assess the term limit and constitutional issue in Benin?
Well, we kind of pause and wait for you to designate who should speak to that.
Since you're speaking.
Jump in and say that Benin in many ways also captures or epitomizes the backsliding that we've been talking about. Because I remember in the early 90s, how all of us, or most of us, in the articles that we wrote or in the speeches that we made, always started with how small countries can also impact big countries, and how what started in Benin as a people-led revolution that ultimately culminated in a national conference became the platform that many Francophone countries used to be able to put an end to one-party rule and to create pluralistic societies. Many of us were excited when, after a military leader who had defined himself as Marxist-Leninist in terms of General Kerekou, lost the election of 1991 to a Beninese or a Beninois who had trained in the US, worked for the World Bank for many years in the person of Nicéphore Soglo. And the transition went very smoothly. And in 1996, in a rematch, Soglo lost to Kerekou, who had been in retirement, and transferred power very peacefully. And so Benin became a success story for most of the continent, and especially for Francophone Africa. But I think what we've seen in the past recent years has been a shrinking of that political space, has been the emergence of violence against political opponents, even including a former head of state, has been a recrafting of legal instruments at the point that Dr. Bikwe was alluding to or referenced, which is using legal instruments to craft new parameters for political participation in a way that's not inclusive, but rather exclusive. And in fact, it reminded me of what the military tried to do in Nigeria in the early 80s, when the military said, we will create just two political parties for all of Nigeria, one slightly to the right and one slightly to the left. And then ultimately, when General Abacha came into power, he wanted, at the time there were 4 or 5 political parties, he wanted all 5 parties to endorse him as their candidate going into a presidential election. And lo and behold, he didn't live to see that election. So there's reason for real concern in Benin, because the 2 parties who then benefited from this very tight legal framework that was initiated by the current president, both parties were created by him and see themselves as supporters of the president. And so in many cases, you can look at the legislature and say that it's not very representative. And the fact that political opponents have not been allowed to stay in the country or conduct their businesses means that Benin is on a very rocky path. And unless there's a national awakening to the fact that the gains of the past 2 or 3 decades may be undermined for the long haul, then Benin could actually slide into a more autocratic state. The silver lining or the good news coming out of Benin is that these civil society activists, lawyers, journalists are speaking up and speaking out, and hopefully they will continue to do so in a way that can keep the government and the executive branch in check. Thank you.
Dr. Beko, maybe you want to jump in on that?
I don't have a lot to add. Chris was very thorough, but the Benin was surprising and disappointing because it was, among the group of, if you will, in West Africa that seemed to have been, kind of on a path of institutionalizing, democracy even further. And it really, I think, draws our attention to the fragility of the progress. And so, just when you might think, okay, the country's on a particular path, it's important not to, I guess, abandon support, because in a way, if you look at Benin and you think, oh, if it could happen to Benin, where else can it happen? Where we assume that the institutions, can absorb these types of changes.
Thank you. I have a question from Janice asking, what hand, if any, has the US played in reinforcing or supporting non-democratic regimes in Africa for the sake of monetary benefit from, let's say, access to raw minerals? Dr. Siegel?
Well, I can say a few things. Historically, especially during the Cold War, the United States, sided with a number of authoritarian governments, for its broader geostrategic interest. Since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. I think has seen Africa less as part of its geostrategic competition with any rival. That's not to say there aren't short-term interest, security interest that might lead the U.S. to to be supportive of a authoritarian leader at the expense of a democratic process or democratic reforms more generally. But I think this notion that the U.S. is interested in Africa's resources is largely a distraction. The U.S. has other places to get resources. It doesn't need to exploit Africa for its resources. I think by and large, the U.S. has played a positive role in trying to uphold norms. It's been very active in trying to build institutions for democracy and the rule of law. It's not to say it's been perfect or it's done this always very well, but I think the U.S. is a positive actor. And for those who've doubted that, I think we can see in recent years when the U.S. hasn't been playing its traditional role, that Africa has suffered in terms of its governance norms. I think we've really seen in the last 5 years that Africa benefits from some strong international actors who are trying to advocate for these democratic norms and upholding the rule of law. That really is a really important complement to the domestic reform efforts that are underway.
Mr. Teming?
Yeah, I would fully agree with what Joe is saying in terms of resource access not being a major driving factor in US policy now. And I think that's been replaced more by the security considerations that we've mentioned a few times tonight. But that's, those considerations are where US policy, I think, sometimes goes off the rails because those things get of some of the democracy and human rights concerns that we're talking about here. It is notable that the Trump administration in its waning days has announced a pullback in some of the US security commitments and activity in Africa, and in particular, pulling Americans out of Somalia. And so it remains to be seen the extent to which all that gets executed in the final weeks. But all that to say, I don't think the resource access has been a major driving factor in U.S. policy for a little while now. That's especially true as U.S. access to oil grows increasingly domestic, given fracking and so forth, and the importance of oil imports from places like Nigeria, Angola, elsewhere is not what it once was.
Thank you. And I have one question here. Before most elections are held in Africa, there is a lot of communication about the US observer going to monitor the conduct of the vote. Once the vote is over, we rarely ever heard again from them until the next one, even when there were some widespread and recorded cases of fraudulent conduct that could have altered the result of the vote. What is actually the purpose of the mission?
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I think it underscores the fact that elections, by their very nature, tend to attract a lot of attention, a lot of media coverage, and the rest of the world gets to follow a country through its electoral process. But when the elections are over, sometimes the media no longer follows. And so when you have, for example, a capacity building workshop or conference for newly elected members of parliament, it doesn't hit the news. So nobody knows that you're there. So if you open up an office and you're working with political parties and their youth, to train youth to be more engaged in political processes, it doesn't hit the news and nobody knows that you're there. So I think most international development organizations that provide technical assistance now see elections as a cycle and not as an event, which a cycle goes from the period before an election, through the election itself, through the period before, after an election, and then into the period before the next election. And I can speak with a lot of confidence to the fact that the US invests a lot of resources in between elections to support organizations or implementing partners that strengthen democratic institutions, working with in partnership with the countries that are willing and engaged in such processes as well. Let me also say, with regards to election observation, that one of the silver linings, one of the very heartening developments that we've seen across Africa in the past 2-3 decades is the emergence of domestic observers. That's Africans from home countries who organize themselves as ordinary citizens, volunteer their time to be able to watch electoral processes in their own countries. And we've seen that in many cases, they mobilize observers in the thousands. They're able to deploy to almost every polling site in the country, or a high percentage of polling site in almost every region or every district in the country or every constituency, something that the internationals are never really able to do effectively. And so the more these citizen-led efforts can gain ground in these countries, in the African countries, the greater the possibility that democracy is going to be safeguarded by well-informed citizens that see themselves as having a stake in the process. Internationals can only do that much and within a short period of time, but the more we create a critical mass of citizens informed, well-educated about these processes and willing to engage on their own, the greater the possibility that these processes are going to be safeguarded. And the work that citizen observers are doing in countries such as Senegal, Ghana, Nigeria, where they even conduct parallel vote tabulations, where they serve as if they were the election commission in terms of gathering data from polling sites, real-time data from results announced in polling sites, and on the basis of that data, project what they think should be the outcome of the elections. And this has served as a means of keeping the spotlight on the Electoral Commission or the election management body to be able to conduct the process in a transparent and credible manner. And they have to be commended for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fomenu.
And just to add something on domestic observers, you know, because we know that election violence happens so far in advance of, you know, election day, when you've got domestic observers that are well-trained and, you know, have created a reputation of being independent, they can start that observation process way in advance of, you know, any international organization coming in. So even as far, you know, ahead as a year before, they can start, you know, observing and reporting on all the processes that lead up to election day. So, you know, in certain countries, domestic observers really do play an important role in making elections more peaceful and kind of stabilizing the environment.
Thank you, Dr. Vickery. Dr. Sigel, want to add to that? Oh, it's 7:50 already.
Yeah, maybe I could just offer a few wrap-up observations. You know, I would, before we close, I just want to recognize that not everything is going in the wrong direction. That you know, there are again a lot of citizens getting organized, trying to uphold these term limits and other democratic rights. In another election in 10 days is in Niger, and there President Mamadou Issoufou, he is stepping down after 2 terms. And so he is upholding that limit. And over the last couple of years, there have been other cases in Liberia and Mauritania, Namibia, where you know, where leaders have upheld the limits. We were talking about Benin earlier, and there, President Talon, you know, he tried to amend the Constitution for term limits and was blocked of doing that legally. That's not to say he isn't still trying to stay in office, but there is resistance. I think it's important. You know, this isn't just some sort of Western interest. This is something really important to many Africans, to a majority of Africans. Yet, as an African in any country, in any part of the world, you know, leaders don't like to leave power. They, you know, power has its own seduction, and what more established democracies have learned is that you don't leave it to the discretion of the leader as to when they leave office. You set a defined period, and you have a succession. You have a very organized way of transitioning, and so it takes the shame or the burden on the leader that they're leaving office out, but it also takes the discretion, or that he has to choose to step down. And these things are decided ahead of time. And this is what helps to lead to the predictability. And I think that's where we need to go in Africa. We need to help build up those institutions that make this a predictable process of transition. And it just makes it a normal thing, because if we leave it, to the goodwill of the leader, that's obviously important, but in the end, there are always going to be leaders, even who are democratically elected, who don't want to leave office. And so we need to try to put the building blocks in place where you can establish these checks and balances, because this isn't just an isolated concern. We find that when leaders evade term limits, they're also evading other types of laws and other types of constraints. And so you're seeing more corruption, you're seeing more patronage, you're seeing more conflict, you're seeing more human rights abuses. And so it's important to hold the line on term limits. It's a clear distinction, it's a clear mechanism that is a key part of many democratic systems around the world. And as we've been saying, I think it's a really important initiative right now at this time in Africa, where you have so many strong executive branch leaders. So let me leave it at that and turn it over to my panelists.
Thank you.
Remarks as well.
So I think we only have 5 minutes. Closing remark. Maybe I'll start with John. Mr. Teming, since you have to drop soon, I'd love to have your closing remark.
Well, yeah, just thanks again to you, Doris, for organizing, and for everyone who's been engaged and for such insightful questions. I would just second what Joe said in terms of it isn't all doom and gloom here. It is the bad stuff that more often makes the news, but there's a lot of progress being made throughout the continent. You look at what's happening in Sudan, for example, and getting rid of a horrific autocrat who'd been in power for decades. And one of the bright spots as well is that survey data also says that Africans remain strongly supportive of democracy as a form of governance, much more supportive than in other parts of the world. And at a time when democracy is suffering globally, that's a really important point to make, I think. So thanks again. Really appreciate the good conversation, and look forward to keeping in touch on these issues.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Teming. We'll stay engaged, hopefully. Dr. Bikoe, I haven't heard from you. Your closing remark.
Just to thank you for organizing the session. I really enjoyed it. There's, while we are seeing some worrisome trends, on the continent, I think, especially in the last 5 years, there are civil society groups that are working hard to uphold democracy. And I think sometimes we overlook that. And those groups, need support in order to do the work that they need to do.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Bikoe. Dr. Fomenu.
Yes, I will just make one concluding remark to say that when Dr. Siegel talked about Niger Republic, it occurred to me that President Issoufou of Niger is doing what no other president of Niger has done before. It's the first time in history since Niger obtained independence in 1960 that a democratically elected president would have served his 2 terms and stood his ground in terms of respecting the constitution of his country and allowing himself to be replaced by another democratically elected president. This is historic for Niger, but the message that I take from there that I would like to share with everyone is that we have to find ways to recognize and reward good performance, that the leaders that respect these terms should be viewed as statesmen even when they leave office, and in fact should become a resource, not just for Africa, but for humanity because of the expertise and experience that they've accumulated while in office. Fighting violent extremism, for example, is something that all of us worry about with regards to the Sahel. when you have a former president from the Sahel that has served 10 years and that is served in this very rough neighborhood and has managed to keep his country afloat despite the challenges from northern Nigeria with Boko Haram, from northwestern border with Mali, and from the northern border with Libya, and has still kept the country afloat. That's a treasure for humanity, and we should tap into it. And that's why NDI have launched the Africa Statesmen's Initiative, which was this initiative to say to former African leaders, that's life after State House. You can even become more useful to your people after leaving the trappings of office because of the expertise and experience that you have. And I think if presidents begin to realize that there's life after State House, they're not going to make living in State House an issue of life or death. So thank you very much, Doris and Scott, for coordinating this, for inviting us. It's been very exciting. Thanks to your participants and members of the New York City Bar and others that have participated in this conversation. We will do it again whenever you need us.
Hopefully we'll see you again. Thank you so much. I mean, thank you the panelists and for accepting so quick in very short notice. That was so exciting. Thank you so much. And thank you the audience, because I mean, you had like a very good questions that I didn't even think about, but it was very exciting. And I hope you come back soon. We'll take more time so that, I mean, we'll engage. I mean, there's so much topic. I mean, we only have one angle tonight, and hopefully we'll do other angles, and shall have more positive news from the continents. I mean, it takes work, it takes effort, and it takes, I mean, this kind of events that we do, little by little. I mean, we have to keep on going, so that, I mean, we won't be talking, maybe in 10 years, we won't be talking about backsliding of democracy, but emerging of exploding of democracy in Africa, hopefully, thanks to your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Doris.
Thank you, Doris.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.